Scent of Desire, written by Emmaline Hoffmeister. Chapter 1. Autumn had draped her russet mantle upon the Hertfordshire hillsides. It was a brisk morning, perfect for a walk. A patchwork of clouds moved swiftly across the sky, the sun breaking through in bursts as Elizabeth Bennet set out from Longbourn. The path along the westernmost edge of her father's estate had always been one of her favourites for viewing the season's splendours. As if to repay her favour, a leaf tumbled towards the earth ahead of her, twisting in the breeze until it came to rest amongst its fallen brethren, heralding the coming winter. She followed the path towards a little stream her father's tenants used for irrigation. The snapping of twigs and crunching leaves underfoot startled a bird from its lofty perch in the criss-crossed branches overhead. She stopped and craned her neck to track the bird's flight. Just then, the kerplop of pebbles splashing into the stream alerted her to the presence of someone else on the path, and she moved forward to investigate. Elizabeth was not surprised when she rounded the bend in the path and found her Fitzwilliam standing at the stream's edge. Cupped in his hand was a small pile of pebbles. She paused and watched him for a time. Unaware of her approach, he plucked a speckled pebble from his pile and cast it into the water. Plunk! It made a small splash and a series of ripples, which were quickly seized by the current. He remained oblivious to Elizabeth's presence, entirely lost in his own thoughts. Elizabeth noticed a dimpled smile momentarily stealing across his face. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the stoic and noble expression so many in the neighborhood, herself included, had once taken as an outward display of his pride and conceit. Elizabeth knew better now. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, master of Pemberley, an estate worth at least £10,000 a year, was not proud and conceited. Those with the good fortune to know him better could not deny his good, kind, and loving nature. Her engagement to Mr. Darcy made her exceedingly happy. The last several months of their acquaintance, beginning with last spring in Hunsford, had been fraught with pain and regret from harshly spoken words, things said without full knowledge of facts and circumstances. But the pain had subsided and been replaced with a firm understanding of his character, and with that understanding came the longing. She had longed to see him again, longed to apologize. Last summer, coming upon him so unexpectedly at Pemberley had embarrassed her. Though the surprise had not been unpleasant, she'd had enough time to recover her composure. When he had talked to her, she had scarcely dared lift her eyes to his face. But then he spoke with her aunt and uncle, and she had been amazed at the alteration of his manner since their last parting. He had spoken to them as equals. His manner showed no condescension, and she could not take her eyes from him. It was then that she first admitted to herself how handsome he truly was. For the first time, she had wished she could take back her previous rejection. That was all behind them now. Coming out of her reverie, Elizabeth gazed at the noble figure of her betrothed and felt her heart begin to race. She put her cool, gloved hands to her flushed cheeks and wondered at the cause of her sudden reaction. It could not be the sight of Mr. Darcy, handsome though he was. Surely, she thought, some other explanation existed for the quickened thudding of her heart against her ribs. After all, he was just a man, and no man had ever before caused such a reaction in her. He was the same man she had danced with at the Netherfield ball, the same man she had walked with around Rosings Park, the same man she had met with last night in the presence of her family. It was not as if they had been parted for long or he had changed in the last 12 hours. And yet, it must be him. She could not otherwise account for her racing pulse. She scolded herself for her immaturity, considering she was no better than Lydia and Kitty had been when they so exuberantly chased after the officers last winter. She ought to have the maturity to be composed in her fiancé's presence. Yet, The exhilaration of seeing him again shot straight through her heart. She took a step forward, and a twig snapped under her boot. Mr. Darcy looked up and took notice of her at last. He tossed his handful of pebbles into the stream and went to her.
"Elizabeth, my dear, there you are. I had hoped I would see you this morning if I walked out this way."
He bowed as he approached her, took her gloved hand, and raised it to his lips. As he kissed her hand, she offered him a deep curtsy. Heat surged up Elizabeth's arm, bursting like fireworks in her breast.
If this is how he affects me when my gloves are on, I have no hope of surviving if he ever touches my skin,
she thought.
How fortunate you are, Mr. Darcy, that I chanced to mention my penchant for early morning walks in this part of the neighbourhood when we spoke last night.
I am fortunate indeed.
Perhaps I should further mention I walk here every morning when the weather permits. What about you, Mr. Darcy? Do you think you will walk out for a morning constitutional tomorrow?
Fitzwilliam, please, Elizabeth, when we are together you must call me Fitzwilliam.
As you wish, Fitzwilliam,
she corrected, her voice portraying every ounce of happiness she felt in saying it.
As for my walking out tomorrow, I shall have to consider it.
Fitzwilliam, I think you must be teasing me.
An impish smile overspread his features, one Elizabeth had never before witnessed.
Of course I am teasing you. Nothing, not even the weather, will keep me from coming in case you should be here. I would not miss one moment of privacy we may have together.
I am glad to hear it, for I very much want you to come.
A flush crept up her cheeks, and her toes curled in her boots. Admitting she wanted to be with him as much as he did with her was more disturbing than she had ever expected it to be. After years of self-reliance, to admit her happiness could be directly affected by another was a new sensation altogether. Unable to meet Fitzwilliam's intense gaze, Elizabeth looked at the ground. Though summer had passed, ladies' bedstraw still bloomed in the fields. She left the path to pick a sprig, bringing the small yellow blossoms to her nose to breathe in the sweet perfume. The honey-scented flowers always soothed her no matter the ailment, be it an irritating mother and sisters or the man she loved, causing her heart to leap out of her chest.
I wish summer would remain all year,
Elizabeth sighed.
It has always been my favourite time of year when the countryside is filled with flowers. It is a shame the flowers will all be gone soon.
I agree, but then again, if the flowers were always here, we would take them for granted. I appreciate their return every spring because it means the close of the dreary winter.
Yes, you are right. I never considered it that way.
Taking the sprig of lady's bedstraw from Elizabeth, Fitzwilliam studied it and then lost himself in a memory of the past. Elizabeth touched his arm to bring his attention back to the present.
Are you all right?
Yes, I was just remembering.
Fitzwilliam offered her his arm, which she accepted, and the pair began to walk while he told her his story.
Each summer, my mother would take me out in her little phaeton on a sunny morning in late July. We would drive to one of the pastures west of Pemberley and park at the edge of the grass. From there, we only needed to take a few steps up the embankment to arrive at our sea of bright yellow flowers at the peak of their bloom. We would pick armfuls of these same flowers and take them home. Mother and I would then place a sprig or two in every vase throughout Pemberley. This annual event was always one of my favourites. Every year, I would wait for my mother's invitation with excitement. I always thought our purpose was to brighten the house, but years after her death, I learned the flowers had another purpose. They keep the bugs away in the summer.
That is not their only use,
Elizabeth responded without thinking.
Really? What are their other uses?
Fitzwilliam inquired.
Well, they say, that is, I understand it helps with...
Elizabeth had heard the village midwife say it could help a woman through a difficult childbirth, but a lady could hardly say such things to a man, even if she was engaged to him. She ought not to have brought it up, and she cursed her tongue for sometimes being quicker than her wits. Elizabeth searched her mind for any mention of the flower's use other than the one she had been thinking of.
It has several medicinal applications,
she said vaguely. By now, her cheeks and neck were 3 shades of red, and she utterly refused to look up at him.
Medicinal applications, you say? How interesting.
Elizabeth was inclined to think he did not believe her, but what else could she do? Tell him what the plant was really known for? No, she could not. Mr. Darcy took pity on her and continued with his story.
Georgiana's birthday is in the middle of July. For her 5th birthday, I had the phaeton readied and took her to the place our mother took me. We picked the flowers, just as my mother had done with me. Then we brought them home and placed them in vases around Pemberley, but it was not the same. I never took her again.
His confession did not require a response, so Elizabeth just tightened her hold on his arm as they walked silently for a few more paces, her free hand swinging at her side, brushing the tops of the flowers.
I'm sure your family will expect you for breakfast. Would you like me to walk you home?
Darcy asked, after assessing the sun's position and consulting his pocket watch.
Yes, I would like that very much.
Mr. Bingley mentioned we would call today around 1. Perhaps then we can discuss a wedding date. Colonel Fitzwilliam will bring Georgiana, but I need to send word of the date so they can plan appropriately.
I am eager to see Georgiana again. I have missed her.
As have I.
I have thought a little about the date already,
Elizabeth said.
Have you a specific date in mind?
No, I only know that I would not like to wait long to marry. There was a time when I thought I would never marry, yet now that we are engaged, I would prefer to wed sooner rather than later.
Darcy stopped on the path and drew in a deep breath. Looking deep into Elizabeth's dark eyes, he said with a low voice,
I would marry you today if possible.
That would be nice, for then you would be the last person I saw at night and the first in the morning.
Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth. So long had she thought about falling to sleep and waking up next to Fitzwilliam that she was hardly aware she had spoken the words aloud until they were already said.
Tear and hounds, Elizabeth. Have you really had such thoughts?
His voice was husky with restrained emotion. Oh, how she loved it.
Do you think less of me for admitting it?
Of course not. In fact, you will be lucky if I do not raise a breeze by hauling you off to the altar before sunset.
Lucky? I should say I would be unlucky if you did not. Now that we are engaged, I do not plan to be missish.
In an instant, Elizabeth's hand was caught by his and he kissed her palm. Again, her heart raced and heat swept over her in waves. Drawing her close, Darcy leaned very near her mouth and whispered,
There will be the devil to pay if you keep talking like that. I must insist you say no more.
Very well, if you insist.
Darcy offered Elizabeth his arm again, and they continued towards Longbourn, each lost in their own thoughts, until Elizabeth spoke up again.
You are right, of course. My father would ring a fine peal over us if we were to do anything untoward. After Lydia's near disaster, he has taken a far greater interest in all of us. I meant to say earlier, before my mouth ran away all on its own, that I have talked with Jane. If you and Mr. Bingley approve, we may share their wedding day in 6 weeks' time. I do not think arranging the event any sooner is possible, for Mamma will insist Jane marry first, her engagement being the longer.
A double wedding sounds an amiable enough business. 6 weeks, you say? I'm sure I did not expect it even that soon, but it pleases me that it will be.
Very well, then. It is settled. If Mr. Bingley agrees, we shall have a double wedding.
He will agree.
How can you be so sure?
Have you ever known Mr. Bingley to disagree with an amiable suggestion? I am not certain the man is capable of dissent.
The lovers stopped in the path as they neared Longbourn's gate. Fitzwilliam bowed over her hand and watched until Elizabeth made it safely to the front door. Rather than waving as she entered the house, she blew him a kiss. She knew it was not decent for a young woman to do, but she did not care. She loved him and wanted the entire world to know it. Chapter 2. Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley arrived at 1 o'clock that afternoon, just as they said they would. The gentlemen stayed above 3 hours and took dinner with the family. The same visit was repeated each day for 2 full weeks, during which time great progress was made on wedding preparations, and each of the lovers took every fleeting opportunity to get to know one another better. On one such visit, Mr. Darcy came alone, as Caroline Bingley had invited Jane to dine at Netherfield, and Mr. Bingley, of course, had elected to join them. Elizabeth deemed it was time they discussed the bevy of social invitations which had been extended to the couple.
I have sorted the invitations by importance,
Elizabeth said.
The first are those who are close family and friends from the neighbourhood who have extended invitations to us both. Rejecting any of these invitations would slight the sender and only cause harm.
Very well. Instruct me as to the manner of engagement and when we are summoned, and I shall attend,
Fitzwilliam said.
Are you sure you do not want to first know who is doing the inviting?
It does not matter. I trust your superior knowledge of local society, and therefore will go wherever you tell me my presence is required.
The first invitation is tomorrow night. Here, I have made you a list in order of event.
Elizabeth, 13 gatherings are listed here,
he said after scanning the page.
And that is only the required events.
You mean there are more?
Quite right. The second set of invitations and its accompanying list
Elizabeth handed him another sheet of paper.
Are from those who have sent an invitation for us both, but who I believe would not be affronted if I arrived alone.
Why would they not be affronted?
Darcy asked, a little affronted himself.
Do not distress yourself. I had thought you would be happy not to be required to attend every social gathering.
I confess I am a little pleased not to have to attend, but I cannot help but wonder why my absence would not cause offence.
Suffice it to say that you have not always made a concerted effort to get to know people in the neighbourhood. Mrs. Long, for example, is still offended that you stood by her for half an hour and did not say so much as one word when you first came to town. I dare say her motive for including you in the invitation stems from a sense of duty rather than a desire for your company. You need not make yourself uneasy over it, for her conversation is hardly worth the effort. There is also my Aunt Phillips. So long as I bring my mother to the visit, she will hardly notice your absence at a mere card party. Finally, we have the invitations, which are addressed to me alone.
Elizabeth sorted several invitations into her hand.
I do not believe you have met any of these people. You do not need to attend unless you wish to be introduced to new acquaintances. I will call on them, and our duty will be done.
It sounds like you have it all worked out, but I think you take far too much care not to force me into society. Elizabeth, I know I do not always make the best impression on people. As you know, I am not at ease in the company of strangers. But let me ask you this. Do you want me to attend every invitation with you, or would you rather go alone to these you mentioned?
Honestly, Fitzwilliam, it is entirely up to you.
Very well. I presume you have a list of these final invitations as well.
I do.
Give it to me, and I will go through them. Mr. Bingley is better known and more well-liked around the neighbourhood, and as the master of Netherfield, he may feel their friendship benefits him. As his good friend and a guest in his house, I would not want to slight those acquaintances. By tomorrow, I will tell you which, if any, of these events I will attend with you.
I think your plan has merit.
Are there any others?
Not at present.
What are your plans for the rest of the afternoon?
Nothing beyond enjoying our time together.
I am glad to hear it. Are you up for another walk today, or have you filled your quota of fresh air?
I shall never fill my quota. I am always eager to flee the confines of Longbourn for a walk, especially if I have the pleasure of your fine company.
Elizabeth fetched her wrap and secured Kitty as a chaperone. The girl was not an avid walker and would soon be left behind, which perfectly suited her elder sister. When Elizabeth returned, Fitzwilliam was waiting for her in the foyer. He already had on his coat and hat, but his hands were bare, his gloves stuffed in his pockets. Offering Elizabeth his arm, he led her outside and down the path towards the hedgerow. As soon as they rounded the bend, the reluctant Kitty already trailing some distance behind, they released each other's arms and laced their fingers together, their warm hands palm to palm. Their walk led them to a small path between two fields. Elizabeth rarely came this way, especially this time of year, as it was generally far too muddy. That was not the case today, for it had been unusually dry. Elizabeth stopped along the path to pick a cluster of ladies' bedstraw. When she had finished gathering the flowers and returned to Fitzwilliam's side, he said,
Elizabeth, thank you for joining me on this walk. I have something I want to give you, but I did not want to do it in the presence of your family.
Elizabeth understood how intimidating it could be to offer a token of love in her mother's presence. Just last week, Mr. Bingley had brought Jane a delicate shawl of Brussels lace. The entire family had been present when he gave her the gift, and Mrs. Bennet's approbation had been so effusive as to border on the inappropriate. Mr. Bingley was, of course, her favourite future son-in-law, so kind and generous. It was no less than her dear, sweet Jane deserved. But why had Mr. Darcy not bought Lizzie anything? He had so much more money. Should he not be showering her with gifts every day of their engagement? After all, he had £10,000 a year and likely more. Surely, a little Brussels lace would be nothing to him. Jane had sat serenely through it all, but not Lizzie. She had been mortified for Jane, trying to hush their mother, and all the while Mr. Bennet hid behind his paper with a wry smile gracing his face.
Fitzwilliam, you do not have to bring me presents. Just being engaged to you is gift enough.
He pulled a small blue velvet box from his overcoat pocket and handed it to her.
I
know I do not have to, but I want to.
Elizabeth accepted the little box and gently opened it.
Oh,
she exclaimed,
it is beautiful.
Fitzwilliam reached for the brooch and took it out of the box for Elizabeth.
This is an intaglio blue sapphire brooch. It was one of my favourite pieces of my mother's jewellery. After she died, I set this piece aside for my future wife. If you look closely, you can see the Darcy crest.
It is breathtaking.
Elizabeth accepted the brooch and gave it a close inspection. The Darcy crest on the blue sapphire was indeed lovely, and the gilded filigree flowers around the edge were equally beautiful, yet not ostentatious like one would expect from such an exquisite piece of jewellery.
Will you put it on?
I would be honoured, but are you not afraid it may get lost on our walk? Perhaps you should keep it safe in your pocket until we return to the house.
I'm not afraid of you losing it, but if it makes you feel better, let us return it to the box.
With great care, Elizabeth placed the brooch back on its velvet cushion, taking another look before closing the lid.
You do spoil me, Fitzwilliam.
Anything for you, my dearest, loveliest Elizabeth.
Fitzwilliam stepped close and wove his fingers through Elizabeth's, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing the back of it. Elizabeth sighed contentedly and moved even closer. Only their hands touched, though both of their postures spoke of longing for more. Gently, his fingers touched her cheek and traced the curve of her jaw as he stared lovingly into her eyes. He meant to kiss her. Elizabeth knew she ought not to permit the kiss, for her mother had warned both her and Jane repeatedly about such things, but permit it she did. The pressure of his fingers beneath her chin drew her near. She could have leaned back and he would have released her, but she did not. She looked up at him. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted his lips on hers. She wanted to know what it felt like to kiss a man, to kiss him. Her hands hung at her side, one empty while the other still held the bunch of ladies' bedstraw she had picked earlier. His hand went to her hip and drew her near. Their bodies were perilously close, and she could feel his breath warm her skin. Closing her eyes, she waited. When their lips first met, it was only the slightest of touches, and could hardly be called a kiss at all. Then his mouth touched hers again. His lips pressed against hers more firmly this time, and then pulled away. Feeling bereft of his touch, Elizabeth laid her hand against his chest and leaned into him until their lips touched again. One of Fitzwilliam's hands slid from her hip around to the small of her back, gently pulling her closer. At last, he had kissed her. It was everything she had dreamed it would be. They were so close, their breath mingled, sending little clouds of vapor into the air around them. He deepened the kiss. His hands became firmer, pulling her even closer. His tongue moved past her lips smoothly, intimately. Time all but stopped for Elizabeth, and she found she was incapable of thought. Her knees were weak, and butterflies fluttered in her stomach. Slowly, she brought her hand up until she could bury her fingers in his hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer as she drank him in. He tried to withdraw, but Elizabeth would not allow it, going up on her tiptoes to keep contact with his lips. Their kiss became hungry, their embrace needy. Still holding the bunch of flowers, Elizabeth wrapped her other arm around him and pressed her body against his. There was no way of knowing where one ended and the other began. Fitzwilliam's hands were now on her hips, and he gently but firmly pressed her back, withdrawing. He rested his forehead against hers for a moment, and she heard him take a breath. Elizabeth tried to kiss him again, but he would not allow it, keeping his lips out of her reach. At last, she gave up. With their foreheads still pressed together, she looked directly into his eyes and whispered,
"I think lady's bedstraw may have some uses hitherto unknown to me."
What do you mean?
Fitzwilliam said, looking at her curiously. Elizabeth held up her bunch of flowers for him to see.
"This flower is called lady's bedstraw. I never considered its name before, but it is rather suggestive, is it not? I wonder if it is an aphrodisiac."
In an instant, Fitzwilliam pushed Elizabeth away and stepped back a pace or two.
I should not have done that,
he said.
I never intended to.
"I wanted you to,"
Elizabeth admitted. She took a step closer to him.
"I want you to again."
Reaching for him, she intended to kiss him as he had her.
No!
He stepped away again.
A lady should not let a gentleman kiss her so, and a man should be gentlemanly enough not to press her.
He paced a few steps, then paused and looked directly at Elizabeth.
You ought not to have let me kiss you.
"True, but—"
No buts, I promise it will never happen again. It cannot. I will not allow it.
"But Fitzwilliam—"
Elizabeth began.
No, Elizabeth, no excuses. It was entirely inappropriate, and it should not have happened. We both of us should have known better. I would have expected such things from the likes of Mr. Wickham and your sister Lydia, but not from us.
Fitzwilliam was entirely too distressed to see the pain he was causing his beloved.
"Yes, I can see how undesirable it must have been for you. It was entirely a mistake, and we must take care to never let it happen again. Perhaps we should return to the house."
Without waiting for him to offer his arm, she turned back the way they had come, her inner turmoil lending an angry energy to her stride. Thinking she must be as embarrassed as he at their lapse in decorum, he let her walk ahead to give her time to compose herself. They collected the exasperated Kitty at a turnstile very near the house. She took no notice of her sister's strange mood, entirely absorbed in her indignation at being left behind for so long. When she received no explanations and scant sympathy from her errant companions, she stamped her foot and ran to the house in tears. Elizabeth rolled her eyes and faced Fitzwilliam.
"Now that we are returned, Mr. Darcy, you may come inside and warm yourself by the fire. There is no need for you to return to Netherfield right away."
Turning on her heel, she hastened to the house before Fitzwilliam fully comprehended the formal use of his name, or that he had distressed her. Elizabeth was almost running by the time she reached the house and opened the front door. Dropping the bunch of ladies' bedstraw to the floor, she raced up the stairs towards her room, not bothering to remove her outerwear. Fitzwilliam entered the house a little behind her, and she heard her mother calling him.
"Oh, Mr. Darcy, there you are. I am sure I was about to send the servants out to look for you. Suppose you had all gotten lost."
Elizabeth closed her door to drown out her mother's exclamations and moved to stand at the window. She could smell the remnants of Fitzwilliam's masculine scent on her clothes and her breath. Part of her desperately wished she could go back in time and erase the kiss, while the rest wanted nothing more than to be in his arms right now, kissing him again. She wanted to lean her head against his muscular chest and feel the comforting embrace of his protective arms around her, but she feared it would never happen again. When Elizabeth entered the sitting room some time later, Mr. Darcy looked most uncomfortable. Mrs. Bennet hadn't given him a moment's respite, forcing him to endure her constant fussing.
There you are, Lizzie. What could you be thinking about keeping Mr. Darcy waiting for you? Come over here. You must hear the wedding plans Mr. Darcy and I have just agreed on.
Excuse me, Mrs. Bennet, but I did not agree to anything. I assure you I will be happy with whatever choice Miss Elizabeth makes, but I do not presume to make any choices on her behalf.
But I thought you said you liked this muslin.
Indeed, madam, I like them all. However, I know nothing of muslin or ribbons and lace, and shall leave the choosing of such trappings entirely to Miss Elizabeth. Now, if you will excuse me, I really must be going.
Stay, sir. Now that Elizabeth has come down, I am sure you will be better entertained. Lizzie, dearest, I do not hear Mary practising. Take Mr. Darcy into the music room and play for him.
I cannot stay,
said Mr. Darcy.
I really must return to Netherfield.
Unable to look up from her lap, Elizabeth held herself stiff and silent, staring at her clasped hands. By far, the morning was turning out to be the worst in history. Gathering her courage, she opened her mouth to speak, just as Mrs. Hill came into the sitting room and announced, "If you please, ma'am, Mr. Darcy's carriage is ready." Elizabeth's hands quivered when Fitzwilliam rose and began to walk across the sitting room without so much as taking his leave of her. Her stomach churned, but not in the same pleasant way as when she had kissed him. As she replayed the kiss in her mind, her temperature rose, her chest tightened, and her breathing accelerated, but for all the wrong reasons. She blamed herself when she remembered what he had said. A lady should not let a gentleman kiss her. She had to say something. She could not allow him to leave under such circumstances.
Mr. Darcy, may I walk you out?
Elizabeth asked rather more timidly than was her wont. He nodded, and she followed him to the front door.
Mr. Darcy, please do not be offended by...
Fitzwilliam, Elizabeth, have I hurt you so badly that you have eschewed all familiarity with me?
His tone was low and intimate, only for her.
Will you not call me by my Christian name? Damn fool, how could I have...
Elizabeth fell silent, shocked by his intimate tone and rarely exhibited passion. She longed for something teasing or witty to say, but she could think of nothing.
I am afraid I have offended you. Would to heaven that I could take it back. But I will not impose on you any longer. I will leave you now.
His voice was tight and formal, losing all of the warmth Elizabeth expected from him.
Please, Fitzwilliam,
Elizabeth begged,
do not leave just yet. Surely we can sit in the drawing room and have a private talk. Or the library. Come, my father will not object to us using the room for 1/2 hour.
Put more at ease by her conciliatory manner, he relaxed a little.
Rest assured, all will be well. Perhaps you might like to join me for a ride in Bingley's phaeton tomorrow?
Yes, I would like that,
Elizabeth agreed.
Until tomorrow, then.
Fitzwilliam bowed and left the house. She stood at her window that night as the day waned and the darkness closed in. Autumn leaves lay on the ground in a colourful patchwork, but many trees still sported their vibrant hues. A chill had crept into the air, and despite the fire in the hearth, Elizabeth could not get warm. When she finally surrendered to the call of her bed, her sleep was broken with haunting memories of her kiss with Fitzwilliam and of him turning away from her. She feared she had ruined everything by allowing him to kiss her, but she would not regret it. No, she certainly would not, especially if it was to be the only kiss she would ever experience. She feared He would end their engagement, and then she would be ruined, sentenced to life as a spinster, with shattered dreams of what might have been had she not allowed her wanton desires to run away with her. Maybe her mother had been right. A woman should not allow a man to kiss her until she had caught him up in marriage. Otherwise, there would be no need to marry her, for he would already have what he wanted. The only thing she had to look forward to was the promise of a solitary phaeton ride with him on the morrow. Chapter 3.
Elizabeth, I can see you are distressed by something. Will you not share your burden with me?
Jane asked the following morning.
Oh, Jane, I have done something terrible,
Elizabeth said, with a voice far calmer than she felt. A distressed look momentarily came over Jane's countenance, but her usual serenity quickly replaced it. She came near Elizabeth to comfort her.
What could you have done, Lizzie? I am sure it is not so terrible as you think.
Yes, I think it must be. I have truly lost Mr. Darcy's good opinion forever this time.
Lizzie, I highly doubt that. You could do nothing to lose Mr. Darcy's good opinion. He clearly loves you.
Yesterday, I would have said the same thing, but now I have revised my opinion.
Could you tell me what you did, so I may judge for myself if it was really so bad?
No, Jane, I cannot tell you, for I would not have you thinking ill of me too.
Elizabeth remembered how 3 days ago she had seen the prim and proper Jane standing in the shadow of the house, accepting secret kisses from Mr. Bingley as the gentleman was leaving. She could not tell her sister it was almost the same action which presently caused her distress. Jane looked imploringly into Elizabeth's eyes and asked,
Dearest Lizzie, you have not lost your virtue, have you?
No,
Elizabeth exclaimed, scandalized that Jane could even think such a thing of her.
at least I still have that.
Then there is nothing to fear. I am sure whatever has come between you and Mr. Darcy will soon be resolved. Just talk to him, tell him your fears, and I am sure he will confirm it is all a misunderstanding.
I am sure you are right, Jane, but I fear it will not be that simple. It is a very personal and perhaps somewhat embarrassing topic. How shall I broach it with him?
I am sure you will think of something. You always do.
Jane hugged Elizabeth and said,
The gentlemen are coming early today. We have little more than an hour to dress and breakfast before they arrive.
Jane primly stood from her seat on Elizabeth's bed and went to the door. Before leaving, she asked,
Will you go to the milliner's with Mamma and me today?
No, Mr. Darcy and I are going for a phaeton ride.
Oh, that sounds lovely. Perhaps you'll have a chance to speak to him of your fears.
Yes, perhaps.
Once she was alone, Elizabeth at last rolled out of bed and went to the wash basin. The water was cold against her skin, making her shiver, and she quickly put on her woolen walking gown, which had been warmed in front of the fire. Soon she hardly felt the morning chill and made her way to breakfast, arriving only a minute or two after Jane. As Jane had predicted, the gentlemen arrived early. So early the family was still at breakfast. But there was no awkwardness. They simply sat down and joined them for a cup of coffee.
You are uncommonly quiet this morning, my Lizzie. I noticed you did not take your morning constitutional. I hope you are not ill.
Mr. Bennet said from behind his paper.
But then I can only assume that, since Mr. Darcy is here early, he too forfeited his exercise.
Elizabeth had the good sense to blush and keep her mouth closed, ignoring her father's rhetorical question. But that did not deter him.
I also noticed, Mr. Darcy, that you have come in a phaeton. Wrong time of the year for such a gig, is it not?
Perhaps for some, but I am convinced Miss Elizabeth and I will find it pleasant enough,
Mr. Darcy said, before taking another sip of his coffee.
Take care you have enough lap quilts for each of you. I would hate to have to tell Mrs. Bennet. You took a chill because there were not quilts enough for the both of you, and you were forced to give yours to Elizabeth. thus ensuring her health and comfort.
Mrs. Bennet began to wail about what an injustice it would be if Mr. Darcy took a chill and died before the wedding. Oh, then what would become of Elizabeth? As soon as breakfast was over, Elizabeth and Fitzwilliam took their leave and proceeded with undue haste to the phaeton. Fitzwilliam set off at a sharp clip, enjoying his chance at the reins. A fine mist hung over the neighborhood, but rather than coat the landscape in dreariness, it enhanced the vibrancy of the remaining red and gold leaves clinging to the trees. Their silence was awkward compared to the lively repartee the couple normally shared. Elizabeth was happy and distressed at being by his side after a night of broken sleep and disturbing dreams. The narrow seat afforded little room between them, and she was far too aware of her hip resting close to his. The sway of the phaeton brushed her thigh against his, the warmth radiating through the barriers of wool and linen, separating his skin from hers. Darcy turned the team down a narrow road. The sound of horseshoes and carriage wheels clattering against the gravel road filled the silence that stretched endlessly between them. They rode past the trail to Oakham Mount, continuing along the road to a neighboring village where neat stone cottages, dotted farmlands and meadows flowed in a lush green carpet as far as the eye could see. When they neared an old, crumbled estate that held a beauty few appreciated, Darcy stopped the phaeton at a bend in the road and helped Elizabeth down. They walked to a low wall at the property's boundary and sat down. Elizabeth could feel the cold dampness of the stones through her coat and dress. Regardless of her uncomfortable perch, she sat for a long time, staring across the fields at the dilapidated farm buildings. Darcy took a seat near her, saying not a word, but Elizabeth could feel the heat of his gaze as he watched her tirelessly. She wondered how long he would remain silent before begging her to speak. He had endured far longer than she had expected he would, and her composure was about to fail her. Then again, his silence should not have surprised her, for he had not spoken often when they first met. Elizabeth looked at him from the corner of her eye and found his gaze had strayed to one of the decayed buildings. She turned her gaze to the same building. A few moments later, she felt him brush aside a wayward curl that had escaped her bonnet. His touch was soft, caring, and genuine. She relished the sensation as he played with the curl, silken strands of chestnut sliding through his fingers. Turning towards him, she looked into the dark pools of his eyes. She fought against her own desires, afraid he would see her doubts and sheer vulnerability.
Elizabeth, what would you have me say in apology? Tell me. I will say anything if only you will forgive me.
Elizabeth saw he was in earnest, and for a moment she could not breathe. Plucking up her courage, she gazed into his steadfast eyes and demanded,
"Kiss me like you did yesterday."
Her insecurities rose when he did not move, but rather sat upon the cold rock wall, looking dumbfounded. Elizabeth turned away, feeling all of the heartbreak and distress of yesterday tenfold. She should not have said it, but it was what she felt. If he could not accept her passion, she needed to know now. Her moving away promptly brought Fitzwilliam to action, and rather than lose the moment, he leapt to his feet and pulled her into his arms, crushing her to him and imploring her lips to respond to his. Her arms wrapped around him, and her heart thundered in her chest as he enfolded her in an embrace that forbade him ever to release her. How she loved being in his arms! Their kiss turned desperate, each needing the acceptance of the other, both fearing further rejection. Elizabeth ran her tongue across his lips, beseeching him to part them and share in the delights that only a man and woman truly in love could experience. He heeded her and parted his lips a little, welcoming her taste. She pressed herself against him, feeling the excitement and discovering his unfamiliar body. Unsure but excited, she boldly caught his lower lip, playing with it. His instinct shouted, even begged to pull her tighter against him, but his gentlemanly upbringing and desire to be her protector had him pushing her away the next moment, as if he had been burned. Elizabeth took a few steps back, afraid she had again done something to distress him. She chastised herself for her foolish actions, fearing she had lost his respect a second time with her wanton demands. Turning, she began to make a hasty retreat, not really knowing where she would go. Anywhere was better than here.
Elizabeth.
Darcy reached for her.
It is not what you think. I can explain.
Elizabeth stopped, turned and looked at him. She did not say a word, but waited for his explanation, forcing her tears to remain at bay. She refused to let him see her cry. Despite his promise to explain, his silence dragged on interminably, and then, unaccountably, he chuckled. Elizabeth could not contain her anguish or her fury.
I hate you, Fitzwilliam Darcy. How dare you play with my affections? Despite what you may think of me, I am a gentleman's daughter. I am respectable and deserve to be happy. I loved you. I agreed to marry you. Was this all a game to you? Do you not want to marry me any more?
Her words tumbled out without thought or intermission. Tears slipped free, mocking her resolve. She crumbled to the ground, gasping for air, feeling her world collapse around her. Never, not once, had she felt so vulnerable. Never had a man affected her as he did. Darcy froze in fear, his laughter dying on his lips. Fear took hold of his heart, and he crumbled beside her, not caring whether his new coat was ruined.
Elizabeth, look at me,
he pleaded, holding her by the shoulders, though she fought against him.
I cannot,
she sobbed.
How can I ever look at you again? I am so ashamed of myself. How could I have allowed myself to fall so hopelessly in love with someone who does not love me in return? I thought you had changed. I thought you loved me. I thought our feelings were mutual.
They are, I do,
he said, embracing her. Elizabeth continued to sob and refused to look at him, but she no longer pushed away. It was enough. He resolved to charge forwards. By God, he would rather risk offending her feminine sensibilities than lose her because he could not control his carnal male appetite in her alluring presence.
Elizabeth Bennet, there is one and only one thing that would ever make me push you away, and it is my nearly uncontrollable desire to bed you.
Elizabeth's gaze snapped to his, shock registering on her face as her tears still flowed.
You have made me say what no respectable gentleman should ever say to a lady.
He smiled. Then, taking her face in both hands, he looked deep into her eyes.
You are the most beguiling woman on the face of God's green earth, and I can hardly withstand your charms. A man as violently in love as I am with you cannot always master himself when his lady is so near.
He leaned forward, kissed her forehead, and whispered against her hair.
Have no doubt, when we are married, I want you to press your body against mine. I will beg you to take my lip between yours as you did today. We will share sensations you never dreamed your body could experience.
His voice rose, still soft, yet tinged with regret as he continued.
But if you want to make it to the altar an untarnished bride, we cannot tempt one another as we have done. A man has his limits.
I thought you were rejecting me, that you wished to break our engagement. I thought I repulsed you because I, a gentleman's daughter, allowed you to kiss me before we were married. You said I was no better than Lydia.
Oh, Elizabeth, I am sorry you interpreted me thusly. Any reproach was for myself alone. I was certain you would regret engaging yourself to a man who could not control his carnal desires. I would never reject you. I could not. You mean far too much to me, and as far as breaking our engagement, you have nothing to fear. A battalion of military men with pistols and sabres drawn could not force me to cast you aside. The responsibility is mine. Therefore, I will keep myself in check to ensure you make it to the altar with your reputation intact.
His speech had all but dissolved her anguish.
I confess I am relieved. All through yesterday and last night, I was most distressed. I truly thought you would leave me. I thought my desire for your kiss had proved I was not the respectable lady you wished to marry. I thought I had lost you, and my heart was broken.
I can see that I have not proven as steadfast as I had thought. I will endeavour to prove it to you daily for the rest of our lives.
I think I will like that,
Elizabeth said, and then she kissed his lips softly. Darcy let out a low, throaty growl that made Elizabeth giggle. He tightened his embrace and whispered,
I will like proving it more once we are married, but until that day, I shall endure such torture. You know not what you do to me.
He pursed his lips and stole a final kiss before letting her go and helping her to her feet. Holding her hands, he rested his forehead against hers again, pouring every emotion he could summon into his plea.
My most precious Elizabeth, from this day forward, promise you will never doubt my constancy.
I promise.
And from today forward, will you allow me to kiss you as you did today and yesterday?
Yes.
And from the day we marry and every day thereafter, will you share my bed and delight me as I fully intend to delight you?
Yes,
she exclaimed, breathless, unable to resist the urge to capture his tantalizing lips, which were luring her in with his pretty promises of love and devotion. When they finally pulled apart, he said,
Come, I think we should return to the safety of Longbourn where prying eyes may cool our ardour. I promised you would reach the altar with an unsullied reputation.
Thank you for the consideration, but I am sure I cannot claim I am entirely unsullied, even if I am still a maiden.
That may well be the case, but no one else need know.
They walked back to the phaeton, hand in hand. He handed her up, and before he could join her, she turned and pertly said,
I am not afraid of you.
He grinned and replied,
I should hope not.
Settling beside her, he drew back on the leaders and eased the phaeton onto the road. Elizabeth swayed against him with the movement. Propriety demanded she move away, put a respectable distance between them, but she did not. Instead, she leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. A soft sigh escaped her lips, and she took comfort in being near him. They had not gone far before Darcy turned to look at Elizabeth and found her asleep, nestled against his shoulder. He gently put his arm around her, protecting her from the jostling of the phaeton. Instinctively, Elizabeth burrowed further into the crook of Darcy's arm and breathed deeply of his scent. Chapter 4. It had been a somewhat exhausting fortnight, filled with a plethora of wedding preparations, selecting dress patterns, ordering a trousseau, making visits, and attending parties held in their honor, all of which left Elizabeth precious little time to steal private moments with her fiancé. The weather, which had been uncharacteristically dry this year, had finally caught up with the season, and the rains had started. However, fortune favored Elizabeth and Darcy today, and a break in the clouds allowed them to go on a little walk during his afternoon call. Since the day of their phaeton ride, the couple had become quite comfortable in each other's presence, keeping no secrets, and frankly telling one another things that most married couples were too shy even to mention. Elizabeth could not imagine a better or happier life and looked forward to her marriage to Fitzwilliam with great anticipation.
Fitzwilliam, it looks like rain. Do you think we should return to the house?
Elizabeth asked as she peered heavenward.
Yes, let us go directly. I had not realized we had walked so far.
Reversing direction, the pair ambled down the return path to Longbourn. They had made it scarcely a quarter of a mile when the heavens opened, disgorging heavy rainfall.
Come, we must hurry,
Fitzwilliam said, taking Elizabeth by the hand and urging her faster towards the house.
What need is there to hurry? We are such a distance that no matter the pace we set, we will be drenched by the time we arrive. A little rain cannot harm us.
The rain itself may not harm, but I am afraid you will take a chill.
Now you sound like my mother, Fitzwilliam. Mamma said something remarkably similar on the day of our phaeton ride, though she was more concerned with your continued good health than mine. Do you remember?
I remember that day well.
Fitzwilliam admitted with a small smile. They had both come to the same conclusion, albeit independently, that their conversation that day was a turning point in their courtship, the point when all barriers had dropped and they could be entirely honest with one another without fear of rejection. It was when they had begun to trust one another, whole heart and soul.
You need not worry for me. I am of a more hearty constitution than Jane. I have gone out in weather twice as bad as this, and been fit as a fiddle the following day.
Fitzwilliam eyed her sceptically, but lessened his pace. Their path, already saturated from previous squalls, was now covered with unavoidable puddles. Elizabeth's boots and petticoat were in a dreadful state, suffering the consequences of the ill-timed outing. Though he looked a little uncomfortable with water streaming under his collar, Fitzwilliam appeared otherwise unaffected.
Are your boots as wet through as mine?
Elizabeth asked, with laughter in her voice.
I can feel the water squishing between my toes.
If your feet are wet, we must get you home immediately. Ladies' footwear is not meant for these harsh conditions. My boots are well made and my feet quite dry,
Fitzwilliam said.
There has been a terrible oversight in the manufacture of ladies' boots. That is unlucky for me, but I assure you I am very well used to getting my feet wet and muddy. In fact, if I remember correctly, I nearly scandalised all of Netherfield's inhabitants last year by arriving to see Jane with my petticoat in much the same condition as it is now. Is that not so?
Perhaps the state of your attire scandalised some, but I was not one of them.
Were you not? I had thought you disapproved of how I arrived on foot and dishevelled as I was.
If my memory serves me, I had no thoughts beyond how fine you looked with your eyes so brightened by the exercise.
Perhaps the exercise did well for my eyes, but it certainly did not do well for my attire. My petticoat was not the only article of clothing that was muddied. When my gown was sent home, Mrs. Hill declared it irreparably damaged and threw it in the poor box before I could have anything to say about it. Perhaps she should have allowed me to keep it. I could have worn it on all my walks and saved unnecessary wear on my other gowns. Oh, and my hair! When I was shown into Jane's room and caught sight of myself in the mirror, I wondered if I should frighten Jane rather than bring her comfort.
I'm sure she was far too glad of your presence to take notice of your appearance.
My sweet Jane, who could not love her. She is the dearest creature in the world.
I did not always love her,
Fitzwilliam began.
But now that I understand her excellent character better, I am pleased that she will soon be my sister. I am also grateful to her for making my dearest friend in the world happier than he has ever been. But I cannot love her as you do, for she is not my Elizabeth.
Such pretty words,
Elizabeth said, raising herself on her tiptoes and quickly kissing him.
So you admired my fine eyes when I came to stay at Netherfield. Do you mean to say you were already in love with me then?
Elizabeth asked.
Why, you had scarcely been in the neighbourhood a month.
Yes, perhaps I was. I was attracted to you, though I would not admit it then, not even to myself.
It is perhaps fortunate that you did not, for at that time I did not like you at all. Had you decided to pursue me, I would have made my dislike plain, and we would not be where we are today. Certainly, our path to love was rocky, but we got there in the end, and that is what matters.
I could not agree more,
Fitzwilliam said. Then looking heavenward, he continued.
What I cannot agree with is how long we have dawdled in this atrocious weather. Come, the rain is falling much harder. If you do not hasten your pace, I will be forced to pick you up and carry you.
The sound of Elizabeth's angelic laughter pierced through the rain.
Carry me! Why, Fitzwilliam, you would never do something so indecent. Just think what people would say if we were seen.
Yes, my dear, do think about it. We would be forced to marry immediately, but since we discussed this issue a few weeks ago, you are safe.
Such a shame,
Elizabeth said, stopping on the path to pick one of the last remaining clusters of ladies' bedstraw.
Eek!
She cried as she was swept off her feet into Fitzwilliam's arms and carried up the path at a pace much hastier than their previous one.
Such exclamations cannot go unrewarded, my love,
Fitzwilliam said, and he took a moment to kiss her before he continued towards the house with her in his arms. Elizabeth had never before been in such an intimate position with a man. When they kissed, her feet were always on the ground, and she could get away if she felt the need. Now, she was completely in his power. She found she quite liked the warmth and security of his strong arms cradling her. Rather than object to the position and demand he release her immediately, she nestled into his arms and tucked her cold nose against his neck just above his cravat. She breathed deeply of his manly scent of sandalwood and leather. His arms tightened around her when she sighed, and his posture became rigid. He kept walking, but slowed to a more sedate pace rather than rushing towards Longbourn. Elizabeth played with the flower stem lying in her lap.
You know, I find I cannot agree with what you said a few weeks ago about taking the flowers for granted if they were always here. I think I will always appreciate them.
I'm sure you will,
Fitzwilliam responded. Elizabeth leaned her head against his shoulder and breathed his scent again. She could get used to always being in his arms.
You should put me down. We are nearing Longbourn. I should have insisted you put me down as soon as you picked me up, but I found I rather liked it.
He stopped at the edge of Longbourn's property, under the folly, and tenderly placed Elizabeth's feet on the ground, making sure she was steady before releasing her. Elizabeth shook out her wet dress, which clung immodestly to her hips and thighs. The rain was still pouring down, but the folly now protected them. It hardly mattered, though, since they were entirely wet through.
I think the weather will likely keep you and Mr. Bingley away for the rest of today. Whatever shall you do?
I will try to finish some letters of business I have put off for far too long.
Fitzwilliam, it is not like you to put off your duty.
It is also not like me to be so much in love.
I love you too. The weather is a sad business, though. I am sure Jane will be distressed not to see Mr. Bingley today, but at least I have had the comfort of seeing you already.
I'm glad of it, for it may be our last meeting for some days. Elizabeth, I must go to London.
London? Whatever for?
I have business to conduct in London and a marriage settlement to fetch from my solicitor's office.
How long will you be gone?
She asked, trying not to sound too disappointed.
3 days, 4 at the most.
Elizabeth drew near and kissed him.
I shall miss you. Please do not delay. I shall not rest easy until you are safely returned to me.
I shall miss you too.
The couple shared another kiss, and then Elizabeth wrapped her arms around his neck and rested her cheek against his chest. His coat was wet and cold, but she took no notice. She wanted to be near him.
Fitzwilliam, when do you leave?
Today.
Surely not. The weather is horrible. Should you not wait until tomorrow?
Who is to say the weather will not be worse tomorrow? If I leave today, I can be at my solicitor's office first thing in the morning, and perhaps, if I press them to hurry, I can return a day earlier.
I can hardly argue with that plan. Come on, then. I shall have Papa order the carriage for you. You must not return to Netherfield on horseback in this weather.
Darcy followed Elizabeth into the house and was glad when Mr. Bennet agreed to call the carriage. Elizabeth excused herself to change out of her dripping clothes, the sound of her mother's usual hysterics chasing her up the stairs.
Oh, Mr. Darcy, look at you. Come in, sit yourself by the fire before you take a chill and die. Oh, how distressing this is. What would happen to my poor Lizzie if you were to die?
Elizabeth shook her head and smiled as she entered her room. Earlier in her relationship with Fitzwilliam, she had worried about what he thought of her mother's outbursts, but now they were confident in one another, and she knew he would not think less of her for her mother's silliness. Ringing the bell for Sarah, Elizabeth began to remove her wet clothing. As she peeled off the saturated layers, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. Her sodden state brought to mind Fitzwilliam's appearance when she came upon him on Pemberley's grounds. How well he had looked in his leather breeches and boots, with his hair wet and tousled and slightly matted against his forehead. Other thoughts followed unbidden, his strong arms carrying her, her body pressed against his, the smell of his skin just above his cravat. When Sarah came in, Elizabeth was forced to bring her thoughts to the present and attend to changing her dress and fixing her hair. Before long, Sarah had her in proper order, and Elizabeth joined the family and Mr. Darcy downstairs.
There you are, Lizzie.
Mrs. Bennet cried.
What could you be thinking of keeping Mr. Darcy out in this weather? I am sure he is not used to your country ways. Just look at him, entirely soaked through. What will you do if he breaks your engagement because of your wild behaviour, or worse, takes a chill and dies of fever? I am sure I will not be able to care for you forever.
As I said, there is no cause for concern. I'm quite well and have no fear of taking a chill,
Mr. Darcy said.
Elizabeth has always been my most adventuresome child. We can only hope that, once the two of you are married, she will settle down and not run about in the wild manner she has been allowed in the past. I raised all my girls to be proper ladies, and look how well they have turned out. My Lydia is already married, and soon Jane and Lizzie will share her good fortune.
Elizabeth had just opened her mouth to deliver a witty retort when Mrs. Hill announced the carriage was ready to take Mr. Darcy to Netherfield.
This is it,
Elizabeth thought.
He will leave for London, and I will not see him for days. Mr. Darcy, may I walk you out?
Elizabeth asked as she stood, assuming his answer would be in the affirmative.
Lizzie, dear, perhaps you had better stay here. I would not have you getting wet again. I am sure Mr. Darcy can very well see himself out.
Mrs. Bennet said.
I will be fine, Mamma. I will just walk Mr. Darcy to the door. I promise not to go outside.
Very well. Take care not to soil your slippers in the foyer.
Mrs. Bennet returned to her needlework, while Elizabeth followed Mr. Darcy to the front door.
Fitzwilliam, take care you travel safely and return to me as soon as may be. I am sure I shall worry endlessly while you are away.
There is no need to worry. The trip is barely 30 miles, and the roads to London are well maintained. I'm sure there will be no trouble.
Even so, please hurry your return.
Not caring that he was still wet, or that they might be seen in the foyer, Elizabeth wrapped her arms around Fitzwilliam and kissed him passionately. The kiss would have to sustain them until they were reunited. Chapter 5. Darcy's trip to London went as planned, and after 5 days, each of which had seemed to drag on for an eternity, Elizabeth espied him, guiding his horse up the gravel drive to Longbourn. She leapt from the window and raced to the front door, nearly knocking down Mrs. Hill in the foyer. She reached Fitzwilliam just as he had alighted from his horse and practically threw herself into his arms.
At last,
said she, kissing him sweetly and then recovering her proper decorum in front of the family and servants who were watching from the windows.
Mamma has kept me trapped inside since you left, forcing me to help her and Jane with the wedding preparations.
Do you not enjoy helping to arrange our wedding?
He asked, offering her his arm and escorting her inside the house.
Oh, I believe I would under different circumstances. It is just that Mamma and I have such differing ideas that we hardly ever agree, and Jane is so amiable, she agrees with everyone, so nothing has been decided. Perhaps Mamma will listen to you. I shall tell you my preferences, and you can hint to her that they are yours as well. I am sure she will relent to please you.
He looked at her with some surprise.
How sly you are. Whatever you need, I shall do it.
Mr. Darcy, you are returned,
Mrs. Bennet said, rushing forward to shake hands with her future son-in-law.
How we have all missed you. Lizzie the most, I think. The girl must have spent every spare moment standing at the window watching for you. It reminded me greatly of your behaviour when you first entered the neighbourhood. Do you remember? I am sure no man ever stood at windows so much as you did then.
Mamma, were you not just telling me you wanted Mr. Darcy's opinion on the wedding flowers?
Elizabeth hastily interjected, so Mr. Darcy did not have to respond to her mother's unintended slight.
Oh, yes. Thank you for reminding me. Mr. Darcy, we are having some trouble deciding on flowers. It is such a shame the wedding is not taking place in the summer, for then we would have more choices, but, as it is, we are confined to whatever we can obtain from the local florist, and the selection in his hothouse is abysmally small. The best we can get are hydrangeas and roses. Jane has already agreed to a bouquet of white roses and blue hydrangeas. It will be the loveliest bouquet, I am sure. I thought it best to have the same for Lizzie, perhaps in a different shade, but matching. Lizzie absolutely refuses. What do you think? Would you not like to see her with a beautiful bouquet like Jane's?
Please tell me every type of flower the florist can provide, and then I will tell you which flowers suit me best.
Let me see now. I have already mentioned the hydrangeas and roses. There are also jasmine, calla lilies, and peonies.
When Mrs. Bennet said calla lilies and peonies, Fitzwilliam noticed Elizabeth slightly nod her head.
I think any of the flowers would be lovely, Mrs. Bennet, but I must confess lilies and peonies are my favourite. Why, the garden below my rooms at Pemberley has the most exquisite peonies, as does the orangery. I am sure they would be a lovely combination. What think you, Miss Elizabeth? Do you like my selection?
Indeed I do, sir. They are some of my favourites as well. I had thought a bouquet of pale pink peonies and calla lilies would look quite well with the dress I am to wear.
Maybe you could add a few sprigs of lady's bedstraw for extra colour.
Elizabeth blushed prettily at the suggestion.
Lady's bedstraw?
Mrs. Bennet crowed.
Why ever would you want that weed in your bridal bouquet? I will agree to the peonies and calla lilies, but I absolutely refuse to allow Lizzie to carry lady's bedstraw up the aisle. It may be good enough for a farmer's daughter, but not my girls.
I think the proper term is wildflower rather than weed. They grow plentifully over the Derbyshire countryside, and I have fond memories of outings with my dear departed mother to pick them.
Oh, indeed, they are a charming little wildflower,
Mrs. Bennet said quickly, afraid she had offended a man worth 10,000 a year, who was willing to take her most headstrong daughter off her hands.
Your mother had excellent taste, I am sure. However, I fear it is rather too late in the season for ladies' bedstraw. The hothouses do not keep them hereabouts, and there will be none to be had come November.
No matter. It was only an idea. Is there any other matter you would like to consult me on?
It could not hurt to know your thoughts on another matter. My Jane has ordered a lovely bonnet and veil to match her wrap and gown. I would like for Lizzie to match, but she has it in her head that she does not want a bonnet and would rather wear a shorter piece of lace attached to a hair ornament. Who ever heard of such a thing? I am sure we can find nothing pretty enough for such a grand event in the Meryton shops. If only she had thought of it before you went to London.
Why, Mrs. Bennet? I can hardly believe our good fortune. I have just the thing. While in London, I saw a pretty hair ornament at the jeweller's shop where I buy my cufflinks and cravat pins. I thought it perfectly suited Miss Elizabeth and made a purchase of it. I had intended it as a wedding gift for Miss Elizabeth, you see.
Fitzwilliam reached inside his waistcoat pocket and pulled out an oblong jewellery box. He handed it to Elizabeth, who was in equal parts flattered and discomfited by his extravagance. She held the box in her hand and gently lifted the lid.
Oh, Mr. Darcy, it is exquisite,
Elizabeth exclaimed.
Let me see, Lizzie,
Mrs. Bennet said, snatching the present out of Elizabeth's hands. Mrs. Bennet inspected the gold and pearl hair comb like an appraiser at auction.
What a pretty piece. This must have cost you a fortune, Mr. Darcy. Yes, Lizzie, you need not wear the bonnet and veil if you wear this in your hair. You must be careful not to draw too much attention to it, though, as the pearls are white and your gown is cream. I'm afraid it will not match exactly.
No one will notice, Mamma. I am determined to wear it. I could not imagine anything which would suit me better.
Very well,
Mrs. Bennet said at last. Elizabeth could finally breathe easy, knowing her wedding attire would not turn out to be the disaster she had expected. Mrs. Bennet asked Mr. Darcy his opinion on a few other minor wedding details, and he gave his opinion on each, agreeing with his future mother-in-law when his future wife gave him no cues to the contrary. His choices pleased her, and soon she excused herself to speak with Mrs. Hill about the wedding breakfast menu, leaving them in the sitting room with only Jane and Mr. Bingley for company. Mrs. Bennet was certainly at her best when planning a double wedding. One could rightly assume it was the pinnacle of her life so far.
I hope I said the right things,
Darcy whispered to Elizabeth.
It was a splendid performance. Oh, but I do hope you are not upset at having to give me the hair comb before you intended.
Not at all. I brought it with me because I was more than half inclined to give it to you immediately. I will come up with something else for a wedding present.
I will have you. I do not need another present.
You shall have to put up with them nonetheless. I have sent to Pemberley for a necklace, bracelet and earrings, which will arrive before the wedding. They are part of the Pemberley family jewels, and Georgiana assures me they will match the hair comb perfectly. I thought perhaps you would like to wear them together.
I am sure they will look exquisite. If I choose white peonies instead of light pink, the jewellery and hair comb will blend perfectly. But let us have no more of this talk. Jane and Mr. Bingley are entirely absorbed in one another and paying us no heed. I want a real kiss.
Jane and Mr. Bingley were, in fact, stealing kisses of their own. Neither interfered when Fitzwilliam pulled Elizabeth into his arms and made up for 5 days of missed kisses.
How I missed you,
Elizabeth said when they broke apart, sliding her arms around his waist and laying her head against his chest.
I told myself not to miss you, but then I missed you all the more. Please promise me we will never be parted again.
Never.
Fitzwilliam held her close, rubbed her back and breathed her in. He needed to kiss her again, needed her lips upon his. Lifting her face to his with a gentle finger under her chin, he relished the moment when their lips touched once more. Elizabeth loved the little shocks his kisses gave her, and how they radiated through her body. She sighed softly into his mouth and kissed him back with all the longing and tenderness she possessed. As Elizabeth gloried in the physical sensations, she longed to love Fitzwilliam as man and wife love one another.
Lizzie!
Jane's gentle and slightly scandalized voice brought her back to her senses.
Perhaps you and Mr. Darcy should join us to discuss the dinner Mamma is hosting in a few days. I am sure your input would be quite valuable.
Slowly, reluctantly, Fitzwilliam let go of Elizabeth. Elizabeth pulled away, but it was the hardest thing she had ever done. Embarrassment flushed her cheeks, neck, and bosom when she realized Jane and Mr. Bingley had been watching them. Jane looked anxious, but Mr. Bingley was obviously happy for her and Fitzwilliam. Fitzwilliam tried to cover his indiscretion by being helpful, but it soon became apparent that Jane and Mr. Bingley really had not needed any assistance with dinner plans. Truly, all the decisions had been made by their mother, and all that was left was for the couples to attend and be the center of attention. Chapter 6. Elizabeth was dressing for supper 2 days before the wedding, when a knock came upon the door.
Come in,
Elizabeth called, hoping Sarah was coming to style her hair.
A delivery for you, miss.
Sarah came in carrying a black box tied with a yellow satin ribbon. Elizabeth accepted the box, then untied the ribbon and set it aside, thinking how well it would look in her hair. Though she was soon to be the wife of a wealthy man, such small economies had been so ingrained in her that she doubted she would ever be able to discard a satin ribbon without regretting the waste. With eager hands, she removed the top of the box and looked in.
Oh,
She gasped.
how beautiful. Wherever did he get them?
The box contained a beautiful long-stemmed white rose surrounded by lady's bedstraw. She blushed, remembering her conversation with Fitzwilliam.
There's a note, miss.
Sarah said, handing Elizabeth a small folded sheet of paper. Elizabeth smelled the flowers again and then opened the note. No one had ever showered her with such luxury as Darcy had the past few weeks. Her heart fluttered and then skipped a beat.
Sarah, I must change my dress,
Elizabeth exclaimed as she closed the note.
I want to wear the yellow flowers in my hair, but they don't match this dress. Will you help me?
Of course, miss, but we must be quick about it. The gentleman will be here before long.
It was fortunate that Elizabeth's pale yellow dress was already pressed. She knew it would complement and show the flowers to their best advantage. Sarah moved with such competence and efficiency as would be the envy of any fancy lady's maid, changing Elizabeth's gown and dressing her hair in excellent time. As Elizabeth descended the stairs, carrying the rose, she saw Fitzwilliam arriving with his sister, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and the Bingleys.
Fitzwilliam!
Elizabeth's voice had not been more than a whisper, but he must have heard her, for just then he looked up and saw her descending the stairs. Not bothering to remove his overcoat and hat, he went to her and took her hand as soon as she reached the final stair.
Elizabeth,
He said in a low voice,
you are a vision. Do you know what you are doing to me by placing those flowers in your hair?
I am sure I have no idea what you mean.
Elizabeth teased. She raised the white rose to her nose and breathed in its intoxicating scent. The sight of her chest, rising and falling with her sigh of pleasure, almost undid him. His response was everything she hoped it would be. Fitzwilliam's eyes were locked on hers as he raised her hand and kissed the back of it. Elizabeth returned the intensity of his gaze, feeling heat rising within her until it consumed her. Her mouth went dry, and she licked her lips to moisten them. Fitzwilliam jerked his head to the side and dropped her hand. Weeks ago, Elizabeth would have been offended by such actions, but she now understood he only needed to compose himself when he turned away to remove his overcoat.
Fitzwilliam, if the flowers are too much, I can have Sarah remove them. I confess I had no notion they would affect you so,
Elizabeth said as they followed the rest of the party into the drawing room.
Leave them be. They are perfect. I like them very much.
The drawing room was full of conversation when Elizabeth entered on Fitzwilliam's arm. The Gouldings, Kings, and Mrs. Collins spoke in one corner. Jane and Mr. Bingley stood near the fireplace, not so much speaking as gazing at one another. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner patiently attempted conversation with them, but ultimately found it was futile. Georgiana Darcy sat with Elizabeth's younger sisters, Mary and Kitty, and Miss Maria Lucas. She was making a valiant effort to overcome her shyness, though Kitty's exuberance seemed to frighten her as much as Mary's stern piety. Maria Lucas, at least, seemed harmless enough, and she engaged that young lady in polite discourse. Mrs. Bennet, Mrs. Phillips, and Lady Lucas paid court to Mr. Bingley's sisters, who despised every second of their attention. Mr. Bennet took a keen interest in Colonel Fitzwilliam, who came with his favourite daughter's recommendation as one capable and worthy of intelligent conversation. Sir William Lucas attempted conversation with Mr. Hurst, but soon found the man's drunken state insupportable, and joined his son-in-law, Mr. Collins, discussing his noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. When supper was called, Mrs. Bennet welcomed their guests, and Mr. Bennet opened the meal with a toast.
My dear friends and family, we are here to celebrate the imminent nuptials of my two most worthy daughters, Jane and Elizabeth. To Mr. Charles Bingley and Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, please join me in drinking to their joy and the contentment which comes with true love.
He swallowed the lump in his throat as the guests voiced their approbation and sipped their wine. All through supper, Elizabeth could not keep her eyes off Fitzwilliam. Each time she saw him, every time he spoke, he became more handsome to her. Twice, he had intentionally touched her leg with his under the table, sending shivers of pleasure racing up her spine. She responded by placing her slippered foot next to his, but she was unsure he noticed. Lifting her foot off the floor, she slid it up the outside of his calf. She stifled a small giggle behind her glass when Fitzwilliam spilt his wine all over the table.
Mr. Darcy, are you unwell?
Mrs. Bennet cried.
You mustn't fall ill. The wedding is in just 2 days. Perhaps you should go home and rest.
I am well, madam. An accident, nothing more. I apologise for the state of your tablecloth.
If that is all, think nothing of it.
Mr. Hill had already responded to the mishap and had the wine wiped up and a new glass poured before Fitzwilliam dared look at Elizabeth. Elizabeth sat gazing at her lap, trying to contain her mirth. He arched a brow and quietly asked,
Is something funny, Miss Elizabeth?
He took care to emphasize the formal address.
No, good heavens, the room is a little too warm, do not you think?
She pressed a cool hand to her heated cheeks as a wide grin stretched her beautiful lips. He stared at her curiously as he cut into his veal.
I had thought it was a little cool this evening.
He whispered for her ears only.
Perhaps you're mistaken. It is not the room at all.
Moving his leg close, he lightly pressed his knee to hers. A blush overspread her cheeks and throat. She took a bite of her food and chewed slowly, watching him as he watched her. A fluttering sensation engulfed her heart. She knew exactly what he was thinking from how he stared intently at her lips. She could not help another blush.
My, how warm this room is,
she thought. She reached for her glass of wine.
Perhaps you should return to the conversation with your cousin,
she advised. He lowered his knife and fork and regarded her.
Am I distressing you?
No, but I must say I am having trouble regaining some semblance of composure.
Very well, if you wish,
he said, his voice deepening. Could he know what his voice did to her insides? She finished her own veal and laid her hands in her lap. Fitzwilliam's knee still touched hers under the table, and, in a surge of confidence, behind the concealment of the draping tablecloth, she ran her fingers over the top of his leg. Fitzwilliam stiffened with a sharp intake of breath. A spoonful of soup was halfway to his mouth, but he calmly returned it to his bowl and picked up his napkin. He dabbed at his mouth, then placed it on his lap, keeping his hands under the table. He sought out Elizabeth's hand and laid his over it, lacing his fingers through hers. His thumb traced small circles while they waited for the next course. Mr. Bennet rose from his seat after the dessert dishes had been cleared away.
Sirs, would you care to join me in the library for a glass of port?
The gentlemen departed, and the ladies soon retired to the drawing-room to await their return. The separation of the sexes after supper was sheer torture for Elizabeth. Knowing Fitzwilliam was in the house and out of reach made her want him all the more. If all of her mother's attention had not been on her and Jane, the time would have passed far too slowly. As it was, Elizabeth was so busy answering questions about the final wedding preparations that she took no notice of the passage of time and was surprised when the gentleman entered the room. Fitzwilliam approached her and took his place next to her on the settee. For another hour, the couple answered a multitude of questions from friends who had not yet heard their plans or, as was more often the case, wished to hear an account unembellished by Mrs. Bennet's nervous fancies. By the time the innumerable questions ended, the dinner party was breaking up and the guests were leaving. Finally, only the Bennets, Mr. Bingley, and Mr. Darcy remained. Colonel Fitzwilliam had been gracious enough to escort Georgiana, Miss Bingley, and the Hursts back to Netherfield.
Elizabeth, you look overheated. Would you like to walk with me?
Fitzwilliam asked. Though no snow had yet fallen, the last rain had frozen over, and the grounds of Longbourn were covered in a lacework of frost. As they reached the end of the gravel and stepped onto the stone pathway, Elizabeth clung more tightly to Fitzwilliam's arm to avoid slipping. She looked about her as they walked, her gaze lingering on the favorite haunts of her past. Beyond the glow of Longbourn's windows, away to the left was the northern road, the same road which led to Pemberley and her future life with Fitzwilliam. In 2 days, they would wed amid all the pomp and ceremony Mrs. Bennet could contrive. Longbourn, Netherfield, and even Lucas Lodge were bursting at the seams with guests for the wedding breakfast, and Elizabeth was certain she and Fitzwilliam would not have another moment alone until they left the county. She longed for him to kiss her again, like he had the day he returned from London, but she knew there was danger there. Without Jane on hand to intercede, she would likely allow him to kiss her senselessly and give him any part of her he desired. Even now, in the darkness, she could see the hunger in Fitzwilliam's gaze as he looked at her lips. She could tell he wanted to kiss her as much as she wanted him to.
Elizabeth,
Fitzwilliam began as they walked arm in arm.
you are unique. There is no one so beautiful to me as you. I am sure I do not deserve your love, but I am grateful you have bestowed your gifts on me.
She turned a dazzling smile on her beloved.
There is no need to flatter me with such pretty words. I have already agreed to marry you.
Be serious for a moment, Elizabeth. I am trying to tell you what you mean to me.
I know. I hope you know I love you too, and I am grateful your love was strong enough to persevere, even when you thought all hope was lost. Oh, how foolish I was! I cannot remember it without regret.
I did not bring you out here to dwell on the past. I have something for you.
He stopped at the garden's edge, where the candlelight from the kitchen window spilled out into the yard.
Fitzwilliam, I told you do not have to buy me more presents.
I know you did, but I could not resist one more. I had this made for you in London.
He produced a small wrapped box and handed it to her. Elizabeth unwrapped the box and took off the lid. Inside was a small, elegantly cut glass bottle holding a few ounces of amber liquid. She pulled out the stopper and sniffed delicately. The scent brought her nose to life, and she sniffed again. The perfume was soft, soothing, and familiar.
Lady's bedstraw. Oh, Fitzwilliam, it is exquisite. Shall I put some on now?
No, do not wear it now. Save it for our wedding.
Elizabeth returned the stopper to the bottle and the bottle to the box, and they resumed their walk around the yard until Mrs. Bennet called them in, afraid they would both catch their death of cold. Chapter 7. Moonlight streamed through Elizabeth's bedroom window, bathing the room in silvery light. Elizabeth could not sleep. A mix of excitement and apprehension kept her awake. Lost in thought, she sat on the window seat and looked up at the stars, sparkling like diamonds scattered across the black velvet sky. Today she would marry Mr. Darcy. Today she would become his wife. Her love and admiration for Mr. Darcy had increased dramatically in the 6 weeks of their engagement. She would be glad to leave behind the uncertainty of single life, dependent on a father whose estate was entailed away on heirs male, and exchange it for the security of marriage to a husband who loved her and whom she loved in return. It was almost too good to be true. Even so, it was difficult to consider being parted from Jane. Dearest Jane, Elizabeth heard her sister stir in the bed they had chosen to share on their last night as Bennets.
Lizzie, dear sister, are you all right?
I am well. Go back to sleep.
Elizabeth responded.
Can you not sleep? Come back to bed then, and we shall talk.
Elizabeth did as Jane requested and crawled under the counterpane, snuggling up to her sister.
There now, Lizzie. Tell me what it is that is robbing you of sleep.
I think it is nothing more than excitement. Jane, do you not realise today is our wedding day?
Of course I do. I must confess I am a little nervous.
There is nothing to be nervous about. Charles loves you as much as you do him. The two of you will make a splendid couple.
Thank you, Lizzie. I think you and Mr. Darcy will also make a good marriage.
Indeed, we are determined to do just that.
The sisters talked until dawn, sharing their hopes, dreams, wishes, and desires until the house came alive with the commotion of final wedding preparations. Longbourn was lit from top to bottom with streams of morning light, when Mrs. Bennet burst into the room with Mrs. Gardiner, Mrs. Hill, and Sarah. Sarah held the curling rod, and Mrs. Hill carried a breakfast tray. Sarah heated the curling rod, while the girls nervously nibbled toast and sipped tea, and then she began the transformation of Elizabeth's glossy brown locks. With expert hands, she wrapped Elizabeth's hair around the rod and held it for just the right amount of time to curl without burning. Once all the curls were set, Sarah and Mrs. Gardiner fussed with her hair until it was pinned in a stunning pile high on her head. Mr. Darcy's exquisite hair comb was tucked in the back with a short length of embroidered tulle hanging from it. While Sarah turned her attention to Jane's hair, Mrs. Gardiner helped Elizabeth into her gown and buttoned up the back. When she finally stepped back to admire her work, she smiled with tears in her eyes.
You look very beautiful, Lizzie,
Mrs. Bennet said, giving her a hug, being careful not to dislodge her hairpins or wrinkle her dress.
Here, do not forget these,
Mrs. Gardiner said, wiping her eyes and bringing over the Darcy pearls, which had arrived from Pemberley the day before.
Thank you, Aunt.
Elizabeth slipped on the bracelet and earrings, allowing her aunt to fasten the necklace. The overall effect was stunning. When Jane was coiffed and dressed, looking even more angelic than usual, all that was left for the sisters to do was wait. Elizabeth settled in for what she was sure would be an interminable interlude. Yet, before she knew it, Sarah announced that the carriage was ready to take them to the church. Before leaving the room, Elizabeth took a moment to dab on the new perfume Fitzwilliam had given her. The honey-sweet scent of lady's bedstraw set her heart racing. Yes, she thought, it is most definitely an aphrodisiac. As the Longbourn carriage carried them the short distance to the church, Elizabeth and Jane clutched each other's hands. This day was bittersweet for both of them. For once, they went their separate ways with their new husbands. They did not know when they would see each other again. The carriage rolled to a stop, and the butterflies in Elizabeth's stomach began a mad fluttering dance. When Mr. Bennet helped her out of the carriage, she could see that the Bingley and Darcy carriages had already arrived. She exchanged a giddy glance with Jane, and they clutched hands again.
Come, Mr. Bennet, get the girls inside,
Mrs. Bennet commanded.
We are coming, my dear,
Mr. Bennet responded. Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Gardiner helped Jane and Elizabeth remove their cloaks and smooth their gowns before giving the girls a hasty kiss and hurrying to the front of the chapel to tell the clergyman they were ready. The wedding march began, and the double doors opened, allowing a teary-eyed Mr. Bennet to guide Jane and Elizabeth up the aisle, a daughter on each arm. The gentlemen awaited them at the front of the chapel. Mr. Bennet handed each daughter to her intended and sat beside his wife. The entire room went silent, and then the clergyman began the ceremony.
We are gathered here in the sight of God.
Elizabeth did not think she would be able to recall the words of the ceremony. She had no thoughts beyond Fitzwilliam, who stood so handsome beside her. His skin was flushed. His eyes smouldered when he looked at her. He looked as if he might burst into flames on the spot. Elizabeth had similar difficulty controlling her own emotions, but somehow she made it through the ceremony and returned to earth the moment the clergyman declared them man and wife and allowed them to share a kiss. Their first kiss as man and wife. Her first kiss as Mrs. Darcy. It must have been a long kiss, for they were interrupted by the clergyman clearing his throat and urging them to sign the wedding register. A few light-hearted giggles were heard from the guests, but nothing could embarrass Elizabeth at this happy moment. The wedding breakfast took place at Netherfield, for the ballroom there was much larger than Longbourn's. Jane and Charles were the centre of attention, which suited Elizabeth and Fitzwilliam, who frequently stole away together to a quiet corner.
Elizabeth, you look...
Once again, he was at a loss for words. He tugged at his waistcoat, as if the temperature had risen a degree or two.
Let me see if I can fill in your words for you. Lovely, pretty, beautiful.
He pulled her into his arms and, bringing his face near hers, said,
"Stunning, ravishing, alluring."
His lips met hers, and the two were lost in a kiss for a long time.
"Are you wearing the scent I gave you?"
Fitzwilliam asked with a husky voice when he finally tore his lips from hers.
I am. Do you like it?
"I love it. I thought I would go insane standing next to you at the altar. It was all I could do to keep from kissing you in the middle of the ceremony."
Yes, I think we did well, though I confess I hardly remember a word of it, so distracted was I by your handsome presence.
Suffice it to say, all you need to remember is that he declared you Mrs. Fitzwilliam Darcy. You are now my wife and mistress of my heart.
The couple shared another kiss until they were ferreted out by Mrs. Bennet and forced to rejoin the festivities for another hour, at which time Fitzwilliam declared they must be on their way if they wished to reach London by nightfall. Mrs. Bennet begged them to stay a little longer, but then relented and helped Elizabeth gather her belongings.
"Oh, Lizzie, my dear Mrs. Darcy, how I shall miss you. You must write to me every day and tell me how you are. I shall be so worried with you living so far away from me. Oh, it is too cruel."
She wiped at an invisible tear and turned to her son-in-law.
"Mr. Darcy, do take care of my girl. Do not let her go scampering about in the wilderness of Pemberley alone. I am sure she will get lost, and then I will be miserable. Oh, do come back and visit me soon."
Elizabeth and Fitzwilliam said farewell to everyone as they made their way to the carriage. Mr. Bennet was the last to say his goodbyes, full of genuine love and affection. As the carriage rolled away from Netherfield, Elizabeth saw him wiping a tear from the corner of his eye. Unlike her mother's, she was sure his was sincere. Chapter 8.
Fitzwilliam, where are we going?
Elizabeth asked when the carriage turned towards Longbourn instead of towards London at the fork in the road.
"It is a surprise,"
he said, leaning back in the seat and smiling.
Will you not give me a hint?
"No hints. You must wait and see."
Looking out the window again, she turned back to him and said,
I can see we are not to return to Longbourn, for we just missed the turn.
"No, we are not returning to your father's house. I think we will not return there until the spring. Does that upset you?"
Elizabeth moved to his side of the carriage to sit near him. Putting her arm through his, she laid her head against his shoulder and rested her other hand on his forearm.
No, it does not. It is no longer my home. My home is with you, whether it be at Pemberley, in London, or in a secret place you will not tell me.
Hearing you say that makes me very happy.
The carriage kept on for another mile before it slowed and turned down a rutted lane.
Good Lord, I thought you once said you had the best driver in England. I think you have been duped. Did you check his references?
Elizabeth clutched Fitzwilliam's arm more firmly, trying to see out the carriage window without bumping her head on the roof.
Why, this is the lane to Longbourn Cottage. Fitzwilliam, is that where you are taking me?
I hope you are not disappointed, but a dusty and muddy drive to London did not sound like an appealing end to this perfect day. Your father agreed to let us use the place for as long as we want. I think a few days will suffice. I sent servants ahead to prepare the place for us.
When the carriage drew up in front of the little cottage and Fitzwilliam helped her out, Elizabeth could smell smoke in the air from the chimney. This humble edifice had always held a place of fondness in her heart. It had not housed a tenant in 20 years, but Mr. Bennet kept it in good repair. He used to joke that it would be Elizabeth's home when she became a spinster. She had often played here as a small child, and as a young woman, she had come here to escape her mother and younger sisters. She loved this place and considered herself fortunate to be able to add another reason for the cottage to be special to her. The footman had already opened the door for them. Elizabeth squealed in delight as Fitzwilliam swept her into his arms and carried her over the threshold. The footman closed the door behind them, and then the carriage rattled away, leaving them entirely alone in their little haven of warmth. The curtains were drawn, flooding the cottage with afternoon sunlight. A roaring fire was in the hearth, and a hearty meal was laid out on the little dining table.
What have you done to the place?
Elizabeth asked, walking around and admiring the new furnishings.
I hardly recognize it.
I may have made a few improvements. With your father's permission, of course.
A few improvements?
Elizabeth repeated, assessing the elegant dining set.
This table is new, and so are the chairs, as are these,
she said, pointing at a matching set of loungers in front of the fire.
Certainly nothing this grand has ever graced this place.
Elizabeth returned to stand before him, laid her hands on the front of his coat, and leaned into him. She heard a sigh of contentedness come from him as he enveloped her in a warm embrace.
Would you like me to help you remove your cloak?
Fitzwilliam asked, leaning down to plant a tender kiss on her forehead.
Yes, I would like that. My slippers too.
A few moments later, they stood side by side, admiring the strangely heart-warming sight of their cloaks hanging on pegs by the door, with their shoes lined up beneath them.
I think our cloaks and shoes look well together. What do you think?
Elizabeth turned to her husband.
I think everything of ours looks well together,
he answered. With a sigh, Elizabeth again stepped into his embrace and leaned against him as he wrapped his arms around her. Tendrils of her luxurious hair brushed against his cheek, which stirred something deep inside him. He closed his eyes and breathed in her heady scent. She raised her face to look at him. Her expression reflected her faith in him as a man and as her husband, her love for him, her desire for him. Her eyes bore into his soul, begging him to love her as she loved him. Almost too softly to hear, she murmured his name.
Fitzwilliam.
He gritted his teeth. He desired them to savor this day and the memories they would create. But he was quickly losing his resolve to take things slowly with his new bride. Elizabeth rubbed her hands up and down his chest and slid them around his neck. The look in her eyes was so inflaming, so full of need, that he could not move. Her full lips were parted as if for a kiss, and she licked them with an inviting gleam in her eyes. Fitzwilliam's resolve wavered, but it did not break. Reaching behind his neck, he clasped her wrists and brought her hands before him. Kissing her palms, he promised,
Soon, my love. First, let us eat.
Taking her by the hand, he guided her to a cushioned seat and helped her sit. Then, taking up the chair next to her, he took up a plate to serve her.
What would you like?
Elizabeth pointed at a few dishes, and he dutifully prepared her plate. Then, taking up a fork, he began to feed her. She took one bite, giggling at the unexpected gesture, and then tried to take the fork from him. He held it out of her reach.
No, Elizabeth, I insist. I want to do this.
Why then, I insist you give me another fork so that I may feed you in return. You cannot have all of the fun.
He produced a second fork, and the two shared a wonderful array of their favorite foods for half an hour. When Elizabeth got a small dab of cream on the corner of her mouth, Fitzwilliam kept her hand from wiping it away with her linen napkin.
Here, let me,
he said, leaning forward to lick the cream. Elizabeth gasped, almost scandalized, but not quite. Her large brown eyes watched him with keener interest. Reaching for a pastry, she scooped up some cream with her finger and wiped it on his cheek. Fitzwilliam said not a word, but held as still as he could when she took the front of his jacket in her hands and pulled him near her. Once she had him where she wanted him, she slowly and deliberately licked off the cream.
Two can play at this game,
she whispered, so close her breath tickled his ear. He wrapped his arms around her, pressing her tight against him, and kissed her hard. She tasted sweet, like strawberries and cream. She melted against him with no hesitation whatsoever, and the kiss continued until any hope of restraint was shattered and they submitted to the temptations of marital bliss. This night, the night of their wedding, the night both had waited longingly for, created a bond of love that could never be broken, a bond so strong it could only be labeled as eternal love.
Elizabeth, You are more than any woman I could have ever dreamed existed.
Am I?
Elizabeth asked with a little gleam in her eye.
You are indeed,
He said, as he pulled her into his arms and tickled that slight spot in the middle of her back he had recently discovered and wished to always use to his advantage. Elizabeth giggled and squirmed in his arms. When a smile so large it encompassed his entire face suffused, Elizabeth knew not what to think. She had caught glimpses of his playful side over the course of their engagement, and it was her intention to bring it out of him as often as she could. If she had her way, the halls of Pemberley would ring with their laughter, but now that she had just witnessed a true smile from him, she was even more determined to bring light and laughter into his life forever. Once again, the pair wrapped themselves in one another's arms and kissed. Their attention to one another was the embodiment of tenderness. Elizabeth trembled under his touch, thanking God she had had the sense not to squander her second chance to become Mrs. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Their life promised to be one of passion, sharing a steadfast love that had already come through many a trial and grown stronger. Out of Pride and Prejudice had blossomed something beautiful and everlasting. Sometime later, lying on the bed in the arms of her husband, her lover, her Fitzwilliam, Elizabeth smiled as she drifted into sleep, surrounded by the intoxicating scent of love-making and ladies' bedstraw. The end.